I never thought a flickering light could feel alive, until the first night alone on the North Sea platform. It blinked in patterns that didn't match any breaker or circuit, and I remember thinking, maybe I'm just tired. That was before I learned there were 11 strange rules I had to follow to survive here. Rules no one explains until you're already trapped. The first one was simple, or so it seemed, yet breaking it left a mark I could feel crawling under my skin. I remember the way shadows stretched across the walls like they were waiting for me, and I wondered if tonight I would live long enough to understand the next rule. I remember the first time I truly understood Rule 1. Never touch a blinking light without first shutting down the main breaker, and how the warning felt heavier than any toolbox or manual ever could. I had been alone that night, walking down the narrow steel catwalk toward the turbine room, when a single overhead light started blinking in a pattern that made my chest tighten. Harris, my coworker, had laughed at me just hours earlier, saying, "It's just a fuse, relax." But the moment my eyes met the flickering bulb, I realized that laughter was far from comforting. Each blink seemed deliberate, almost sentient, as though the light was communicating a warning I could barely comprehend. The hum of the platform machinery under my feet contrasted with the eerie rhythm above, reminding me of how fragile my position was out here. So far from shore, I hesitated, hand frozen midair near the switch, feeling the steel rail vibrate slightly under my touch, and I thought again about the exact words of Rule 1, trying to embed them deep in my mind like a lifeline. "It's just blinking," I whispered to myself, though even the sound of my own voice felt wrong in that cold mechanical corridor. The shadows of the platform stretched in strange jagged lines along the walls, distorting with the blinking intervals, and I realized my own shadow seemed to twitch independently, like it had noticed me first. My instincts screamed that touching the light could unleash something I wasn't ready for, and yet curiosity clawed at me, teasing the edges of rational thought. Harris had been skeptical when I told him I was afraid, joking about my imagination running wild, but the truth was, I had never felt alone on this platform in a way that made my stomach churn until now. I decided to step back, letting my gaze trace the blinking pattern while I tried to map it against the breaker panel I had memorized. Every flash seemed synchronized with the soft creaks of the metal beneath my boots, a silent symphony of tension I couldn't ignore. I whispered to myself, "Just check the breakers first, never touch it first," repeating Rule 1 quietly, as if saying it out loud could reinforce its power. The light seemed to respond, blinking slower, almost contemplative, as if it were measuring my obedience. A low wind swept through a vent, carrying the scent of salt and oil, and I imagined it could mask 100 dangers lurking just beyond my sight. My heart pounded so loudly that I was convinced the flickering might somehow see it, and I thought about what might happen if I ignored the rule even for a second. Hours drifted past, marked only by the rhythmic blinking and the constant hum of the turbines. I sat on the grated floor, tracing cables and trying to convince myself that electrical failure was the culprit, but every instinct in my body screamed against that simple explanation. Shadows seemed to gather near the light, merging into darker shapes that only existed at the corner of my vision, and I realized that obeying Rule 1 wasn't just about surviving electrical shock. It felt like a pact, a contract I had yet to fully understand. Harris's skeptical voice echoed faintly in my memory, and I wondered if his dismissal of the rules was why he didn't understand what had happened here before. A shiver ran down my spine as I noticed that the blinking had begun to form irregular intervals, creating shapes that resembled letters, though I couldn't read them. I tried calling Harris, but my radio only emitted static, a low, insistent hiss that seemed to mirror the light's own pulse. Every attempt to communicate felt wrong, and I remembered Rule 1 again, its warning now heavy in my chest, tying me to the present moment and forcing me to obey, despite the growing urge to reach out. My flashlight flickered briefly, synchronized with the overhead bulb, and for a second, I thought I saw movement within the shadows themselves. A part of me rationalized, maybe it's rats, maybe it's loose equipment, but another louder part screamed that nothing on this platform moved like that under normal circumstances. I crouched low, holding my wrench like a shield, aware that my body was vibrating with anticipation, each heartbeat echoing against the metal hull. By midnight, the light's pattern had become almost hypnotic. I found myself counting the blinks, matching them to the rhythm of the platform's vibrations, and noticed an unsettling regularity that didn't belong to any circuit diagram I had ever learned. I whispered once more, almost pleading with the rules, "Don't let me mess this up." Rule 1. Never touch a blinking light without first shutting down the main breaker, and for a moment the light seemed to respond by pausing, holding its gaze upon me. My mind wandered briefly, imagining what might happen if I ignored it, and the thought alone sent a cold panic through my veins. I remembered old stories from the night shift workers, hushed warnings about people who had vanished on the platform, and I realized that obeying the rules wasn't just precaution, it was the difference between life and an unmarked death. The hours dragged into something unmeasurable, the boundaries of time collapsing under the oppressive hum and the blinking light's silent interrogation. I noticed a faint vibration beneath the platform, a pulse that didn't match the machinery, something subtler yet more terrifying. The shadows started forming patterns, stretching into shapes that seemed deliberately placed, like fingers pointing at me, at my hesitation. My throat went dry, and I whispered a reminder to myself, Rule 1, as if repeating it could anchor reality against the creeping horror. I thought of Harris again, imagining his disbelief turning to panic if he were standing where I was, and a deep sense of isolation pressed against my chest, almost physical in its weight. I approached the breaker panel with slow, deliberate movements, each step sounding like a drumbeat in the cavernous turbine room. I checked every switch meticulously, reminding myself why Rule 1 existed. The blinking light had a way of punishing even the smallest lapses in attention. My hands trembled as I flipped the main breaker, and the light flickered violently before stabilizing into a dull, steady glow. Relief surged for a brief moment, but it was quickly replaced by the awareness that obeying this rule didn't make me safe. It only delayed what was coming. Somewhere beyond the walls, in the unlit sections of the platform, I felt a presence watching, waiting, testing whether I would falter again. I sank against the wall, trying to calm my racing heart, but the momentary pause in the blinking light felt like a countdown rather than a reprieve. I realized that Rule 1 was more than guidance. It was a covenant with the platform itself, a warning embedded in every pulse and shadow. The distant echoes of footsteps or shifting machinery seemed to move independently of any human source, and I knew I wasn't alone in my fear. As I sat there, trying to convince myself that I had survived the first test, I felt a subtle pressure behind my neck, as if the platform itself had exhaled, acknowledging my compliance. And yet, despite the temporary calm, I sensed that the night was far from over, and that the blinking light was only the beginning of something much worse waiting in the shadows. The moment the breaker clicked, and the blinking light steadied, I thought I could finally breathe, but then a deep, vibrating hum rolled through the platform, low and insistent, rattling the metal beneath my boots. I froze, remembering Rule 2, never enter the turbine room when the platform hums louder than usual, a rule I had been warned about but never truly understood until now. The hum didn't belong to any machine I recognized. It wasn't in any of the logs or schematics, and yet it resonated through every wall, every beam, almost like a heartbeat. I debated retreating to my cabin, but instinct nudged me forward, curiosity gnawing at the edges of caution, as if daring me to break the rule. Shadows twisted along the walkways, elongated by the dim emergency lights, and I realized that hesitation alone might already be noticed. I stepped cautiously toward the turbine room door, my boots whispering against the grated walkway, and tried to convince myself it was just machinery operating out of rhythm. Harris had probably laughed if he had seen me now, muttering something about paranoia and ghosts. But I knew the rules weren't suggestions, they were lifelines. The hum grew louder with each step, pulsing like a distant drum, and I could feel it vibrating through my chest, making each breath a conscious effort. I whispered to myself, almost as a prayer, Rule 2, trying to embed its warning into my very bones. The platform felt alive, as though it could sense my disobedience, and the shadows along the turbine room walls seemed to pulse in tandem with the hum. Inside the control room, I studied the gauges and displays, all normal, yet the hum persisted, deeper and more resonant than anything I had ever heard. I considered calling Harris over the radio, but the static hiss was even more oppressive now, almost drowning my own voice. "You're imagining things," I muttered, though I knew better than to try convincing myself. Every fiber of my body screamed that entering the turbine room now could trigger something irreversible. I remembered the old night logs, the ones never meant for new electricians, describing technicians who vanished or were found with wide, terrified eyes after ignoring this very rule. The thought of those untold fates made my skin crawl, yet the hum seemed to call me forward, testing my resolve. I inched closer to the turbine room door, pressing my palm against the cold steel, feeling the vibration seep into my hand. My mind tried to rationalize the sound as an electrical anomaly or a resonance from the sea, but the hum carried a weight and intent that no explanation could satisfy. Shadows pooled in the corners of the room beyond the door, stretching unnaturally, and I could swear they moved toward me, drawn by the thrum of energy. I whispered to myself again, "Rule 2, a reminder I hoped would be enough to anchor my sanity." The door seemed to breathe with the hum, expanding and contracting subtly, and I realized that even the steel walls were part of this unseen test. The turbine room was impossibly vast, yet every surface reflected the same deepening hum, the vibrations resonating in patterns I couldn't trace. My flashlight flickered once, then steadied, revealing cables snaking across the floor like living veins. I stepped carefully over them, each footfall producing a sound that seemed swallowed by the vibrating air. I considered retreating, but curiosity clawed at me, reminding me that disobedience wasn't just tempting, it was inevitable in the face of the unknown. The hum intensified, almost conversational, like it was speaking in a frequency my ears couldn't fully register. I paused mid-step, wondering if my very presence was an intrusion, and my pulse spiked, each beat sinking eerily with the low, thrum-like vibration. Suddenly a metal grate shifted beneath my hand, sending a sharp vibration up my arm, and I realized the platform itself was aware of every movement. I whispered again, almost pleading, "Rule 2, hoping the admonition would shield me from whatever waited inside. My own shadow flickered in the emergency lighting, but then I saw it stretch beyond the limits of my body, elongating unnaturally across the turbine walls, and I realized I wasn't alone. Something deep and patient was observing me from the shadows, measuring my caution against my curiosity. I wanted to call out, to break the oppressive silence, but the sound would travel too far, and I feared what might respond. I edged further inside, the hum now vibrating through my teeth, and noticed that the turbines themselves were static, the spinning blades frozen in unnatural alignment. It was as though the platform had stopped for me, holding its breath, testing whether I would respect the rule or press forward. I thought of Harris and his skepticism, imagining his laughter if he knew I was trembling over machinery, and yet I couldn't shake the sense that he would never have lasted a night here. Each beam of my flashlight revealed something unsettling. Tools arranged in impossible angles, shadows that didn't match their objects, reflections that seemed to move independently. I shivered, aware that ignoring Rule 2 had consequences I didn't fully understand. Then as I stepped closer to the center of the turbine room, the hum shifted, lowering almost imperceptibly, before spiking into a deafening resonance that made the floor vibrate beneath my boots. My flashlight flickered violently, and for a split second, the shadows merged into a form that seemed humanoid, yet impossible in every detail. I froze, holding my breath, realizing that the hum was no longer just a sound, it was a presence, aware and deliberate. The warnings from Rule 1 and Rule 2 collided in my mind, both insisting that I retreat, but curiosity and terror rooted me in place. The form lingered, just beyond clarity, as if waiting to see whether I would continue my intrusion. I considered backing away slowly, but the sense of being watched intensified, pressing against my senses, like the pressure of the sea outside the platform. The hum's frequency shifted again, vibrating in patterns that almost felt like language, yet indecipherable, taunting me with incomprehensible intent. I whispered once more, Rule 2, like a mantra, hoping that obedience could protect me from whatever I had disturbed. My pulse raced, matching the cadence of the hum, and I realized with a sinking certainty that disobedience here wasn't an accident. It was a trap. The shadows around me twitched, subtly at first, then more insistently, as though testing the boundaries of my courage. A sudden metallic clang echoed from deep inside the turbine room, far enough to be ambiguous, but close enough to send my heart into overdrive. I wanted to run, yet my legs felt anchored, weighted by the hum and the anticipation of what might emerge from the darkness. The shadows stretched again, forming shapes that mirrored my own movements with a fraction of delay, as if mimicking and mocking me at the same time. I whispered Rule 2 one final time in the room, feeling the words like a fragile shield, yet deep down I knew that the night had only just begun, and the platform was far from finished testing me. I had never imagined that shadows could feel alive, but standing in the turbine room, watching them stretch and twist against the metal walls, I realized the platform had rules far stranger than any handbook could explain. I reminded myself of Rule 3. Never look directly at the platform shadows when they move unnaturally. A warning that sounded ridiculous, until I saw a shadow detach itself from a support beam and slither along the floor, as if it had a mind of its own. My heart thumped violently, each beat echoing against the steel, and I tried to focus on the machinery instead, but the shadows had a magnetic pull that made it impossible to ignore. Harris's teasing voice from earlier floated in my memory. "You're imagining things again," he had said, but now I understood that imagination had nothing to do with it. This was something older, something alive. I inched backward, careful not to let my eyes wander directly toward the twisting shapes, and I whispered quietly, "Just don't look at them. Follow the rule," hoping that the mantra would shield me from whatever punishment came with disobedience. The turbine room felt impossibly large now, stretching into darkness beyond the reach of my flashlight, and the shadows began to move faster, almost circling me in subtle patterns. Every instinct screamed that I shouldn't blink or glance, yet my peripheral vision was consumed by their motion, like watching ripples in a disturbed pool that refused to settle. My breathing grew shallow, and I felt the hairs on my arms rise as if tiny electric charges ran along my skin, warning me of a presence I couldn't yet see. I tried to retrace my steps, careful to avoid looking at any area where shadows gathered unnaturally, but the platform seemed to anticipate my movements, stretching and contracting in ways that made navigation a delicate, tense exercise. The hum from earlier still resonated through the floor, now accompanied by faint metallic groans that might have been the turbines, or something else entirely. I whispered again, almost pleading with the rules, Rule 3, trying to imprint its warning into my memory like a lifeline, because I had a growing sense that a single glance could make all the difference. My hands trembled against the metal railing as I advanced slowly, sensing that the shadows weren't just moving, they were watching me, testing my compliance and my fear. A sudden flicker of light from my flashlight cast the shadows into grotesque relief, elongating them into forms that resembled twisted human silhouettes with impossible angles. I flinched, fighting the urge to look directly, and reminded myself of Rule 3, trying to anchor myself to the fragile safety it promised. Each shadow seemed to follow my peripheral vision with precision, stretching just beyond the edges of what I could clearly see, and I realized that acknowledging them directly might trigger something irreversible. I whispered my own warnings, half to myself and half to whatever unseen force inhabited the room, praying that obedience could buy me more time. The turbine room felt alive, breathing around me, waiting to see if I would falter. I moved along the grated walkway, toward the far side of the room, careful not to turn my head fully toward the moving darkness. My flashlight barely illuminated the edges of the shadows, revealing glimpses of twisted shapes that didn't correspond to any structural element of the platform. I thought of Harris again, and the jokes he would have made, but the fear that had rooted itself in my gut told me he would never have lasted here, that his skepticism might have invited whatever cursed presence now occupied the turbine room. Each flicker of the light seemed to exaggerate the shadows, giving them an almost predatory patience, as if they were calculating how long I could resist their pull. My breath came in short, controlled bursts, and I whispered Rule 3 once more, using it like a mantra to prevent my eyes from straying. As I reached the edge of the turbine room, a shadow darted closer, stretching impossibly over the railing and along the walkway toward me, and I realized that obeying the rule wasn't enough. Hesitation or even acknowledgement could provoke it. I held my flashlight steady, angling the beam away from its path, but the shapes moved with an intelligence that defied logic. I felt an icy pressure against the back of my neck, and the floor vibrated subtly beneath my feet, as if the platform itself were complicit in their movement. My pulse raced, each beat synchronized with the distant hum, and I understood for the first time that the shadows were not merely visual, they were tactile, sensing my fear, testing my obedience. I took slow steps, careful to let the shadows dictate the space between us, and noticed that as long as I avoided direct eye contact, they didn't close in. The realization that my survival depended entirely on this delicate balance was almost unbearable. I whispered the rule again, Rule 3, a quiet acknowledgement that compliance alone might not guarantee safety, and tried to map the shadows' patterns to a mental grid of the turbine room. Every shadow seemed to warp and twist around structural beams and cables, creating impossible angles and empty voids, and I wondered how many people had broken this rule before me, paying a price I couldn't yet imagine. The hum grew, rising and falling in unpredictable intervals, vibrating through the metal and air alike, and the shadows seemed to pulse in harmony, a silent rhythm I had no right to understand. I reminded myself constantly not to look directly at them, and yet my peripheral vision was suffused with their presence, bending reality in subtle, unrelenting ways. A shiver ran down my spine when I noticed a reflection on a polished steel panel, my own silhouette perfectly mirrored, except for the shadows behind me, which twisted independently, moving with a consciousness I could not trace. I swallowed hard, whispering Rule 3 one last time, understanding that the shadows were waiting for even the slightest misstep to strike. Just as I felt I had reached a precarious equilibrium, a shadow stretched impossibly from the corner of the room and collided with the floor near my feet, the vibration of its movement sending tremors up my legs. I froze, muscles locked, wishing I could retreat without turning toward it. The turbine room seemed to close in, the walls bending subtly, guiding me deeper into its space. I realized then that Rule 3 was only the beginning, a threshold meant to teach me obedience, patience, and fear, and I understood with icy certainty that failing it could unleash something far worse than any machinery failure. The shadows paused for a fraction of a second, as if considering my compliance, then shifted again, leaving me teetering on the edge of terror and exhaustion, knowing the night was far from over. The moment I thought I had mastered the shadows, a sudden chill crawled across the turbine room, seeping through my clothes and straight into my bones. I shivered violently, realizing that Rule 4, never ignore the temperature drops inside the platform's enclosed sections, was not just a precaution, it was a warning etched into the very air around me. The cold was unnatural, biting and precise, settling into places that heaters should have protected, and refusing to rise no matter how much I moved. I glanced around, my flashlight revealing only more shadows, longer and darker than before, stretching in directions that made no sense. Harris had joked about the North Sea wind, making the platform feel colder than it was, but this was different. This chill had intent, a deliberate weight pressing on me. I moved cautiously toward the corridor that led back to the control room, feeling each step echo unnervingly against the steel floors. My breath came out in visible puffs, and even though the heaters along the walls were running, they offered no comfort. I whispered, almost pleading to myself, Rule 4, trying to anchor my awareness to the guidance embedded in those words. The shadows seemed unaffected by the cold gliding over the floor and walls as if it didn't touch them at all, reinforcing my sense that the temperature was another layer of the platform's silent warnings. Every instinct screamed that the chill was alive, almost sentient, pressing me toward a corner of fear I had never explored. I paused near the stairwell that led to the observation deck, noting the way the temperature plummeted with each step into the lower levels. The metallic surfaces felt icy to the touch, even through my gloves, and I realized that the cold wasn't uniform. It was moving, pooling in certain areas, as though marking territory. My flashlight flickered slightly in the frigid air, and the shadows around it seemed to stretch farther than the beams could illuminate. I whispered to myself, Rule 4, trying to embed the warning into my brain, because the very awareness of the rule seemed to act as a tether against the creeping sense of dread. Even Harris's jokes about me imagining things didn't echo here. This was a reality I had to navigate carefully, with obedience as my only weapon. The cold seemed to press from every angle, against my back, under my boots, and along my arms, until I felt my muscles tighten in response, stiff with tension. I could see my breath forming clouds that lingered unnaturally, like smoke caught in the still mechanical air. Every step I took was deliberate, measured, because I understood now that a single misstep in this freezing environment could draw attention from whatever lurked in the corners of the platform. The turbine room had been one test. This cold was another, subtler, and just as punishing if ignored. Shadows moved along the walls and across the floor as if inspecting me, and I whispered Rule 4 once more, a mantra to enforce awareness and caution. I ventured into the maintenance corridor, a narrow stretch lined with pipes and cables, and the cold intensified, freezing the air in front of me like a solid wall. My flashlight barely penetrated the darkness, and I could see frost forming on sections of the metal railing. The hum from the turbine room still lingered faintly, resonating through the steel, but the vibration felt distorted here, like the platform itself was shifting its attention. I realized that each enclosed section had its own personality, its own rules, and this particular chill seemed to have chosen me as its test subject. I whispered again, almost desperately, Rule 4, understanding that awareness alone might not be enough. My actions had to match the rule perfectly. The temperature drop was accompanied by an oppressive silence, the usual mechanical noises muffled as if the cold had absorbed them. Every step I took was measured and deliberate, my boots barely making a sound, yet the shadows seemed to anticipate my movement, shifting in synchronization with the cold. I reached a junction where the corridor branched in 3 directions, and the cold pooled most densely toward one path, drawing me forward despite every instinct screaming to retreat. I whispered the rule in a low voice, trying to keep myself steady, and felt the icy fingers of fear curl up my spine. The platform, the shadows, and the cold itself all seemed aligned, testing me, challenging my resolve, gauging whether I would obey or falter. As I edged forward, I noticed frost forming unnaturally on the walls, patterns that resembled fingers reaching out to me, and my pulse raced at the thought that they might move closer if I ignored them. The cold wasn't just temperature, it had intention, and I could sense its movement, subtle yet purposeful. My flashlight revealed glimpses of machinery frozen in time, but the shadows between the pipes seemed liquid, almost fluid, stretching across the walls in impossible angles. I whispered Rule 4 quietly again, feeling it resonate through me, grounding me in a fragile sense of compliance as I edged deeper into the icy corridor. Suddenly, a distant metallic clang echoed down the passageway, and the temperature dropped even further, so fast that I could see my own teeth clattering in the faint light. I froze, feeling the cold press in from every direction, as though invisible hands were nudging me toward an unseen edge. The shadows seemed to pause for a fraction of a second, then began to move more aggressively, creeping along the walls with a predatory patience that made my stomach knot. I whispered once more, Rule 4, knowing that obedience was the only thing keeping me tethered to safety, yet fearing that it might not be enough. The corridor opened into a small equipment chamber, the metal walls frosted over entirely, the lights dim and threatening to fail. I could feel my boots sticking slightly to the frozen floor, and the shadows seemed thicker here, more concentrated, almost solid. Every instinct screamed to retreat, but I knew that the platform had traps laid in every enclosed section, and the slightest hesitation could provoke something unseen. I whispered the rule internally, letting it echo in my mind, and felt the air pulse slightly, like the platform itself was breathing, gauging my compliance. My flashlight flickered, shadows shifted, and I realized I was on the edge of another threshold, a place where disobedience could invite consequences beyond imagination. I thought the cold had been the worst the platform could throw at me. But as I exited the frozen equipment chamber, a single red light blinked faintly above the door I had just passed, and I froze instantly. I reminded myself of Rule 5. Never ignore the warning lights that appear in rooms you've just left. Realizing too late that the platform had ways of signaling danger, even after I thought I had escaped it. The light's pulse was uneven, almost deliberate, and I felt a subtle pressure behind my eyes, as if the very air were trying to force my attention back. Shadows gathered along the corridor I had just traversed, elongated and twisted by the dim emergency lights, and my pulse raced at the thought that I might already be too late. Harris would have laughed at my caution, but I knew that no laughter could survive here. The platform demanded obedience. I stepped forward cautiously, forcing myself to look ahead rather than back, though every instinct screamed that the blinking light wasn't simply a warning, it was a lure. The hallway seemed to stretch unnaturally, the steel walls bending subtly in the corners of my vision, as though the platform itself were reshaping to test my compliance. I whispered quietly, Rule 5, trying to anchor myself to the knowledge that the rules existed for survival, not convenience. The hum from the turbine room had faded slightly, but a new vibration had begun, subtle and insistent, pulsing through the metal floor beneath my boots. Every step felt like a negotiation, balancing the need to keep moving with the terror of triggering something I didn't understand. I passed the blinking light without turning my head, using my peripheral vision to track its pulse as I moved toward the control room. My flashlight flickered faintly, revealing shadows that didn't correspond to any objects in the hallway, and I realized that the light's warning extended beyond the immediate room. It influenced the behavior of the platform itself. I whispered again, almost pleading, Rule 5, hoping the rule would shield me from whatever unseen force was monitoring my actions. The temperature shift from the previous room still lingered on my skin, a reminder that every enclosed section of the platform carried its own hazards, and that the rules were a fragile thread connecting me to survival. A sudden creak from the ceiling above made me flinch, and the shadows responded, stretching longer as if reacting to sound and motion. I remembered every whispered caution from previous night workers, tales of people who ignored the rules and vanished without a trace, and I felt the weight of history pressing down on me. I focused on the blinking light, counting its pulses silently in my head, aware that it seemed to mark intervals of observation, almost like a heartbeat measuring my compliance. Every instinct screamed that looking directly at it, or moving too slowly, could provoke whatever watched from the darkness. I whispered Rule 5 again, a mantra to maintain focus, to resist curiosity, and to survive the platform's tests. The corridor opened into the control room, but the red light continued to blink faintly in my peripheral vision, tethering me to the rules even as I thought I was safe. I could feel a subtle vibration beneath my feet, like the platform was aligning itself with the light, and I realized that ignoring it, even for a moment, could have consequences I couldn't yet imagine. Shadows pooled in the corners, shifting imperceptibly, as though evaluating my reaction. My flashlight illuminated scattered tools and cables, but the shapes of the shadows defied the room's geometry, crawling along the walls with independent intent. I whispered once more, Rule 5, focusing on compliance, my hands shaking slightly as I traced the control panels. I moved carefully through the control room, aware that the red warning light wasn't simply a passive signal, but an active participant in the platform's behavior. Each time I adjusted a dial or glanced at a monitor, the shadows shifted and the light pulsed in subtle changes, a rhythm I couldn't yet decode. I imagined Harris standing behind me, scoffing at the fear, and I realized that skepticism wouldn't have protected him from the platform's rules. Obedience was the only defense, and the blinking light's persistence reinforced that fact in the most insistent way possible. I whispered Rule 5 internally, committing it to memory, understanding that ignoring even a minor cue could unravel my fragile safety. Suddenly, a low metallic vibration echoed from deep inside the platform, accompanied by a subtle drop in temperature, and the red light blinked faster, sharper, demanding attention. I froze in place, feeling as if the walls themselves were closing in, shadows stretching longer in reaction to the light's urgency. My pulse quickened, matching the irregular rhythm of the warning light, and I realized the platform wasn't just sending a signal, it was communicating expectation, testing my compliance under pressure. I whispered Rule 5 one last time, feeling the words resonate like a tether, knowing that every step, every glance, and every breath mattered as I navigated this precarious environment. I edged toward the far side of the control room, careful not to glance back directly at the blinking warning light, but the shadows seemed to anticipate my movements, stretching in directions that defied logic. The hum from the turbine room returned faintly, vibrating in tandem with the red pulse, as if the platform were orchestrating a symphony of fear, testing every nerve in my body. I reminded myself that Rule 5 wasn't just guidance, it was the difference between surviving another hour and being consumed by something beyond comprehension. As I stepped toward the doorway leading to the observation deck, I realized that obeying the rule wasn't enough. Constant vigilance was the only way to navigate this living nightmare. The light blinked again, sharp and insistent, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a shadow detach itself from the walls, moving with intent toward the far side of the room. My breath caught, and the cold pressed in around me, the platform's metallic skin humming in response to my awareness. I whispered Rule 5 one final time, a fragile prayer and reminder, knowing that ignoring the signal, even for a fraction of a second, could invite consequences that I wasn't prepared to face. The shadows shifted, the temperature pulsed, and the red light blinked faster, leaving me teetering on the edge of dread, every nerve alert, knowing the platform had more tests waiting in the darkness beyond. I had thought I understood fear until the North Sea wind screamed through the observation deck, bending steel and rattling the lights above, and I remembered Rule 6. Never go near the railings during platform storms. No matter how stable it looks, the wind tore at my jacket, tugged at my boots, and sent icy rain spraying across my face, each drop stinging like tiny needles. I held the railing tightly with both hands, resisting the urge to glance over the edge, because the platform had a way of testing disobedience with lethal precision. Harris's voice echoed faintly in my memory. "It's fine, you'll survive." But even if he were here, I knew that storms like this were designed to punish anyone who ignored the rules. The storm was relentless, hammering against the platform with an intensity that made my teeth chatter and my muscles ache. I could hear the cables above straining against the gusts, metal creaking in protest, yet the worst of it wasn't the wind, it was the way the platform seemed to respond, shifting subtly, testing whether I would obey. I whispered to myself, Rule 6, trying to embed it deep in my mind as a shield, but the shadows cast by the emergency lights stretched across the deck, moving unnaturally, almost dancing with the gusts. Each step felt precarious, and I realized that a single miscalculation near the edge could send me tumbling into the freezing water below. The storm was alive in a way I couldn't have anticipated, as if it had its own intelligence tuned to the rules. I moved slowly along the deck, keeping my body pressed to the inner railing to minimize exposure, but the wind continued to buffet me, testing my resolve. The shadows flickered and stretched across the steel floor, reaching toward me in ways that didn't make sense physically. I kept repeating Rule 6, a mantra and lifeline, aware that the platform's tests were far more dangerous than any mechanical hazard. Even the smallest slip in attention could draw a reaction, and the storm seemed almost conscious, interacting with the shadows and lights to orchestrate fear. I felt the metal beneath my gloves vibrate with the force of the wind, each tremor a reminder of how exposed and fragile I was. Lightning flashed across the horizon, illuminating the endless expanse of gray water below, and I realized that despite the solid steel, the platform's edges felt impossibly close. I hugged the railing, leaning my body toward the inner side, and whispered again, "Rule 6, feeling the words like a lifeline against the storm's punishing force. Shadows danced across the deck with every gust, elongating and warping in patterns that seemed deliberate, almost sentient. The wind carried strange, low-frequency sounds, almost like distant voices or the groan of massive bones, and I realized that the storm wasn't just wind and rain, it was part of the platform's warning system, a test I couldn't ignore. The rain soaked through my gloves and jacket, chilling me to the bone, and every step required careful balance. The steel grating beneath my boots was slick, and I could feel it shifting slightly under the assault of wind and water. I tried to concentrate on the center of the deck, where the emergency lights flickered dimly, and ignored the edge as much as I could. Shadows stretched across the deck, sometimes merging with the darkness of the storm beyond, and I realized they were more than visual anomalies. They reacted to the wind, almost testing whether I had the discipline to follow Rule 6. Each gust of wind made my heart pound, and I felt the first twinge of panic threatening to overwhelm my rational thought. I inched toward the inner catwalk, keeping one hand glued to the railing and the other gripping my flashlight, and noted how the storm's intensity seemed to focus on me, as if aware of every move. The shadows didn't flee or retreat, they moved in subtle ways, stretching with the wind and creating shapes that felt almost predatory. I whispered Rule 6 to myself repeatedly, using it to keep my thoughts tethered to obedience rather than panic. Every second felt like a negotiation between my fear and the platform's unforgiving rules. I realized that the storm was teaching me in the harshest possible way that disobedience near the edge wasn't just dangerous, it was fatal. The wind roared even louder as I reached the midpoint of the deck, bending steel cables overhead and sending water cascading over the edge. The shadows shifted again, twisting unnaturally with the gusts, and I felt my pulse sync with the rhythm of the storm. I whispered the rule once more, Rule 6, as a fragile mantra, understanding that survival depended on respect and discipline in equal measure. A sudden jolt of the platform, subtle but enough to throw me off balance, made me grasp the railing tighter, and I realized that even minor missteps could trigger consequences far beyond simple injury. The shadows seemed to observe, waiting for any hint of disobedience. Lightning struck close by, briefly illuminating the endless black waves below, and I shivered violently as the temperature plummeted with the storm's gust. Every shadow seemed to ripple in tandem with the wind, and I realized that Rule 6 was more than just caution. It was a test of resolve and focus under the platform's relentless pressure. My flashlight beam caught fleeting glimpses of shapes that shouldn't exist, and the knowledge that I had obeyed the rule only for now gave me a fragile sense of security. The storm was a living thing, bending the platform to its will, and I knew the moment I failed to respect the edge even slightly would be my last. I edged closer to the safety of the inner catwalk, every step deliberate, muscles tense, and hands gripping the railing like lifelines. Shadows moved around me, echoing the wind's force, stretching and shrinking with every gust. I whispered Rule 6 one final time, committing it to memory as a shield against the storm's intensity. A sudden louder groan echoed through the steel framework, and I realized that surviving this wasn't just about following the rules, it was about understanding the platform itself. The edge was still just beyond reach, the storm still testing me, and I understood with bone-deep certainty that Rule 7 was waiting just ahead, ready to push me even further into the platform's relentless lessons. I had barely caught my breath after surviving the storm, when a faint, unintelligible murmur drifted upward from the lower levels of the platform, chilling me in ways the wind never had. I reminded myself of Rule 7, never leave a secured hatch open when you hear whispers coming from below, knowing that any lapse in vigilance could invite something far worse than the shadows or storms. The voices weren't loud, just faint, but each syllable carried a rhythm that made my heart hammer in my chest. I considered retreating, sealing the hatch immediately, But curiosity gnawed at me, a dangerous temptation I had learned to resist only partially. The hum of machinery in the background seemed to quiet, as if the platform itself was holding its breath, waiting for my next move. Stepping toward the nearest hatch, I noticed that the metal around it had grown icy slick from condensation that wasn't there moments before, and my pulse quickened. The whispers didn't seem to belong to anyone alive. They had a quality that was wrong, like a voice stretched and distorted, hovering just beyond comprehension. I whispered Rule 7 under my breath, using it to steady my nerves as I carefully inspected the latch. My glove slipped slightly against the frozen metal, sending a shiver up my arm, and I realized that the platform's rules weren't suggestions. They were lifelines that demanded full attention at every instant. Shadows shifted unnaturally in the corners of the hatch room, elongating in ways that made it impossible to track their true form. I forced myself to secure the hatch fully, pushing down on the heavy metal latch with deliberate pressure, but the whispers grew louder, now circling the air like invisible serpents. My flashlight illuminated the grated walkway below, revealing only darkness and the faintest glint of reflective surfaces that might have been water, metal, or something else entirely. I whispered again Rule 7, focusing on the words like a mantra, and felt a momentary sense of control as the latch clicked securely in place. But the relief was fleeting. The platform seemed to pulse in anticipation, the shadows stretching closer to the hatch, reacting with a predatory patience that made my stomach knot. The whispers became more insistent, almost as if they were coaxing me to break the rule, to leave the hatch open for just a second. I hesitated, trying to suppress the urge to glance downward into the black abyss, and the cold air from below snaked upward, carrying with it a damp, metallic scent that set my teeth on edge. My heart raced as I considered the logs from previous nights, accounts of technicians who had ignored a hatch or two, only to vanish without a trace. I whispered Rule 7 silently, pressing my body closer to the door, and reminded myself that compliance wasn't a choice here. It was the only thing keeping me tethered to life. The shadows seemed to respond to my movements, stretching along the walls with impossible angles, and I realized that ignoring the whispers, even in thought, could be just as dangerous as physically leaving the hatch open. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat, to ascend back to the observation deck, where the storm's chaos had at least been tangible. But the platform held me in place, its iron and steel framework humming with anticipation. The whispers swirled around my feet, teasing the edge of comprehension, and I felt the temperature drop further, an unnatural chill that seeped into my bones. I could feel the vibrations of the machinery through the floor, but they seemed to sync with the whispers now, like some unseen orchestra testing my focus. I whispered Rule 7 again, trying to convince myself that the mere acknowledgement of the rule would protect me from whatever lay beneath. I forced my gaze downward, without looking directly at the source, scanning the surrounding metal grates and support beams for anything unusual, yet the shadows and darkness blended together seamlessly, defying my perception. My flashlight revealed brief glimpses of shapes that moved independently, stretching along the rails and floor in ways that made no sense. Each flicker of the light seemed to provoke the whispers, which rose in pitch, undulating rhythmically. I whispered Rule 7 quietly, hoping that the simple act of remembering the rule could reinforce its protection, a fragile tether between obedience and catastrophe. The platform itself seemed to pulse in response to my tension, as if testing my reaction, teaching me that hesitation or curiosity could be deadly. The cold grew sharper, biting at my hands through the gloves, and the shadows twisted again, merging and separating in ways that suggested movement beneath the hatch, but nothing fully visible. I could hear my own heartbeat, thumping in sync with the soft metallic groans of the platform, and I realized that the whispers were almost alive, reacting to fear, testing obedience, and punishing inattention. I whispered Rule 7 once more, repeating it like a prayer as I inched toward the hatch exit, careful to keep it sealed at all times. A subtle vibration traveled up through the metal grates, and the shadows seemed to pulse in response, confirming that the platform had eyes and ears in places I could barely imagine. I moved back along the corridor leading to the inner catwalk, every step deliberate and careful, feeling the unseen gaze of the platform's lower sections as I passed. The whispers receded slightly but remained in my peripheral awareness, a constant reminder that disobedience, even accidental, would have consequences beyond comprehension. Shadows flitted along the walls and ceiling, not pursuing, but observing, testing my adherence to Rule 7 with every careful step. I whispered it again silently, allowing the words to act as a shield against the rising panic, and noted that even a momentary lapse in attention could allow something to slip through the hatch or from the shadows. The sense of being tested never left me. The platform, the storm, and the shadows all seemed to converge on this rule, emphasizing that vigilance was the only path to survival. I had barely escaped the tension of the whispers from below when a sharp metallic groan rolled through the structure, making every beam tremble slightly underfoot, and I froze instantly. I reminded myself of Rule 8. Never touch the emergency switches when the platform creaks unusually, knowing that the slightest rash action could provoke the platform's unpredictable consequences. The lights flickered above me, plunging the corridors into a brief but suffocating darkness, and my flashlight revealed shadows that twisted unnaturally with every groan. My fingers itched to reach for a nearby switch, to force stability or call for some semblance of control, but the rule rang in my mind like a warning bell I could not ignore. Harris's teasing voice floated back from memory, mocking my caution, yet I knew full well that skepticism could be fatal here. I stepped carefully along the walkway, glancing at the emergency panels without touching, aware that the groaning vibration seemed to pulse in rhythm with the shadows along the walls. Each creak was deliberate, calculated, a test to see if I would obey the rule or act on panic. I whispered Rule 8 under my breath, trying to internalize it like a mantra, because awareness alone might not suffice. The cold from the previous chambers still clung to my jacket and gloves, making my fingers stiff, and the shadows seemed to sense my hesitation, stretching and contracting with unnerving precision. My pulse quickened as the platform seemed to watch, aware of every choice, every thought, and every twitch of curiosity. The corridor twisted ahead, narrow and lined with pipes that vibrated subtly with the creaking structure, and I felt the instinctive urge to steady the platform using the emergency switches. I fought the impulse, reminding myself that Rule 8 existed for a reason, and that control was an illusion here. Shadows flitted along the ceiling and walls, forming shapes that seemed almost human yet impossibly distorted, as if the platform itself were mocking my desire to intervene. I whispered the rule again, quiet and deliberate, trying to focus solely on navigation and observation, and realized that each creak resonated not just in metal, but through the air, vibrating into my chest and bones with a weight I could barely endure. I approached a junction where 2 emergency switches were mounted, their panels glowing faintly, tempting me with the promise of immediate stability. Yet I remembered Rule 8 and forced my hands to remain by my sides. The shadows along the walls seemed to lean closer, stretching over cables and beams in ways that defied logic, almost daring me to act. I could hear my own heartbeat echoing alongside the groaning steel, and the combination of vibration, shadows, and isolation made the air itself feel alive, oppressive, almost sentient. I whispered the rule silently, letting it resonate through my mind as a fragile tether, a reminder that obedience was my only shield against the platform's subtle tests. Every step I took felt heavier as the groaning intensified, the platform shivering under a weight I couldn't see. My flashlight revealed glimpses of cables and panels, but between them, shadows moved with impossible fluidity, flowing like ink on metal. I whispered Rule 8, focusing on the mantra to suppress the panic clawing at my chest, knowing that even a fraction of hesitation could draw attention from the lurking presences. The air grew colder, denser, and each vibration resonated as though the platform were alive, calculating my compliance, pushing me to make a choice I could not afford to make incorrectly. I moved cautiously to the next section of the corridor, the shadows flitting and twisting with each groan, following my peripheral vision, never attacking, but always observing. I felt the metal floor beneath me subtly shift, vibrating with a rhythm I couldn't predict, and my pulse began to match it involuntarily. The temptation to reach for the emergency switches was immense. Any normal technician would have done so, but Rule 8 reminded me that survival here demanded discipline, patience, and respect for the platform's warnings. Shadows stretched across the corridor walls, forming grotesque patterns that made my skin crawl, and I realized that their intent wasn't immediate harm, but to see if I would succumb to instinct over obedience. I slowed my pace, trying to map each creak to the nearest support beam, feeling the vibration travel up my legs and into my torso. The platform seemed alive, every groan a deliberate test of restraint, and I realized that touching a switch in this state would have consequences beyond mechanical failure. I whispered Rule 8 again, repeating it like a prayer, forcing each syllable into my mind as a lifeline. Shadows moved in tandem with the creaks, elongating and recoiling in impossible ways, and I felt a cold sweat running down my back, as though the platform itself were aware of every nerve in my body, waiting for me to slip. The further I moved down the corridor, the louder the creaks became, resonating with the subtle hum of distant machinery, and I understood that each vibration carried a warning embedded in its rhythm. Shadows twisted and morphed along the walls and ceiling, sometimes blending into the metal, sometimes moving independently, always testing me. I whispered Rule 8 silently once more, letting it echo through my consciousness, a fragile but essential tether between me and disaster. The platform's pulse and the shadow's movement seemed to converge, creating a sense that the entire structure was watching me, aware of my compliance or lack thereof, and I realized the night was far from over, that Rule 9 awaited, promising yet another challenge deeper than the last. I had barely stabilized my nerves from the trembling corridors when I began hearing soft, deliberate footsteps echoing faintly behind the steel doors of the maintenance section. I reminded myself of Rule 9. Never follow the faint footsteps when you hear them echo behind closed doors, knowing that curiosity could be deadly on this platform. The steps weren't loud, but they had a rhythm that seemed unnervingly human, deliberate yet impossible to locate, bouncing unpredictably through the hallways. I stopped, holding my flashlight tight, and whispered quietly, "Just ignore them. Stay with the rule," as the echoes seemed to respond to my hesitation. Harris's teasing voice in my head almost mocked my fear, but now even his boldness would have faltered under the platform's invisible scrutiny. The corridor ahead stretched endlessly under flickering lights, and the footsteps seemed to creep along the walls as if aware of my attempts to avoid them. Shadows twisted along the ceiling and floor, forming grotesque shapes that elongated in response to the echoes. I whispered Rule 9, letting it anchor me, forcing my feet to remain stationary and my mind focused. Every instinct screamed to investigate, to confirm what the sound belonged to, but I understood too well that even a single step toward it could pull me into danger. The platform seemed alive in these moments, reacting to fear, rewarding obedience, and punishing curiosity in equal measure. I forced myself to keep moving away from the sound, my boots clicking softly on the grated metal floors, the echoes of the phantom footsteps now trailing me in perfect counterpoint. The air grew colder, the shadows lengthened and warped, and I realized the platform's design magnified perception, making it impossible to discern what was real. I whispered Rule 9 again, using it as a shield, because acknowledging the rule seemed to create a fragile barrier against whatever lurked behind the closed doors. Each echo, each metallic whisper of steps, carried a weight of unseen intent, and I understood that my survival depended entirely on discipline and focus, rather than curiosity or courage. The corridor twisted ahead into narrower sections, lined with pipes and cables that thrummed faintly under the platform's vibrations. The footsteps persisted, but I resisted the urge to look behind each door, to follow the sound, instead moving deliberately toward the inner catwalk. Shadows slid along the walls in fluid, unnatural patterns, reacting to my presence, stretching toward the doors as if guarding secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. I whispered Rule 9, forcing the words into my mind like a talisman, because hesitation or doubt could be punished instantly. The footsteps occasionally seemed to pause, as though testing me, and each pause made my pulse quicken. Each step I took an act of calculated obedience. I reached a junction leading to the engine room, the footsteps echoing faintly from a corridor I had just passed, and a shiver ran down my spine. The temperature had dropped again, subtle and creeping, and the shadows now appeared thicker, almost solid, leaning into the corners. I whispered Rule 9 internally, reminding myself that no investigation could bring clarity here. The rule existed because the platform had designed consequences for those who disobeyed. The echoes seemed to shift with the shadows, blending and stretching across the metal walls, and I felt the first pang of real dread as I realized that ignoring the rule was not optional, it was survival. I forced myself to proceed slowly toward the inner catwalk, eyes fixed ahead, flashlight cutting narrow beams through the darkness. Yet I could feel the presence behind the closed doors. Each step caused the platform to groan subtly, a vibration underfoot that seemed to respond to my obedience. The shadows twisted in impossible angles, forming jagged patterns that reminded me of skeletal hands reaching toward me. I whispered Rule 9, letting it resonate in my mind, repeating it like a prayer to keep panic at bay. Every instinct screamed to flee or investigate, but the rule was clear. Curiosity here meant danger, and compliance was the only path to survival. A sudden metallic clang echoed from deep inside the engine room, and the footsteps shifted in rhythm, as if aware of my proximity. I froze, feeling the shadows pressing in, the temperature dropping further, and my pulse began to sync with the irregular echoes. I whispered Rule 9, forcing myself to remember it not just as a guideline, but as the boundary between life and the unknown horrors waiting in the corridors. The platform seemed to bend perception around me, stretching distances and exaggerating the echoes to test whether I would falter. My breath came in shallow bursts as I inched forward, knowing that the next hallway could reveal consequences for any slip of obedience. The inner catwalk stretched before me, narrow and lined with support beams, with shadows now moving independently along the floor and walls. The footsteps were gone for a fraction of a second, leaving only the vibration of the platform beneath my boots, but I could feel the attention lingering. I whispered Rule 9 silently, focusing on the rule as a lifeline against fear, aware that the slightest distraction could draw my attention toward the phantom echoes and doom me. The temperature continued to drop, and the shadows grew darker, almost pulsating, as if counting my steps, my compliance, my breath. I reached a small junction with access panels to maintenance hatches, and I realized that the whispers of the previous rules, the shadows, the temperature, the warning lights, all seemed connected to this moment. The footsteps might return at any second, but I kept moving, careful not to follow, careful to obey. I whispered Rule 9 one last time, letting the words echo like a shield in the empty corridor, my flashlight slicing through the darkness, illuminating nothing but stretched shadows and vibrating metal. The platform seemed to breathe around me, testing my restraint, reminding me that compliance was the only thing keeping me tethered to life. Beyond this junction lay yet another trial, a Rule 10 I could already sense pressing its own challenge upon me, heavier than any before. The metallic groan from deep within the platform reverberated through the corridors, low and deliberate, and I froze immediately, recalling Rule 10, never open the supply lockers, after hearing distant mechanical groans. My hands itched to pry open the nearest locker for a flashlight or tools, but the vibration through the floor reminded me that temptation here could be fatal. Shadows clung to the edges of the walls, twisting unnaturally in the dim light, and I whispered to myself, just follow the rule, don't touch anything. Harris would have said I was overreacting, but the platform had taught me in harsh lessons that overconfidence could be lethal. I inched past the row of lockers, my boots scraping lightly against the metal floor, careful not to disturb anything unnecessarily. The groans were irregular, yet their rhythm seemed purposeful, almost like a heartbeat measuring my patience and obedience. I whispered Rule 10 silently, letting the words anchor me to safety, as the shadows stretched and shifted along the walls. The cold from earlier chambers still lingered, making my breath visible in quick bursts, and I realized the platform had a way of combining all its hazards into a single, overwhelming test. Every instinct screamed to open a locker, to search for a weapon or tool, but I forced my hands to remain still, obeying the rule with every ounce of willpower. The lockers themselves seemed to exude a quiet menace, their edges darkened by shadow, their surfaces slick with condensation, as if aware that I was considering them. Each groan echoed through the corridor, resonating in my chest, and I felt the vibration travel up my legs in a warning pulse. I whispered Rule 10, focusing on the mantra, and noticed that the shadows seemed to respond, stretching toward the lockers in ways that defied physics. My flashlight illuminated only partial angles, leaving elongated darkness in every corner, and I felt a growing sense of being watched, tested, evaluated for compliance. One wrong decision now could ripple across the platform, drawing attention from things I didn't even understand. I moved cautiously past the lockers, careful to step only on the areas where the metal felt least unstable, aware that the vibrations from the groans could cause an unexpected shift. Shadows seemed to drift along the walls, detaching from surfaces briefly before snapping back, as if keeping me under constant observation. I whispered Rule 10 under my breath, reinforcing the rule in my mind like a lifeline, knowing that acknowledging it was as critical as obeying it. The groans grew slightly louder, longer, like the platform itself was inhaling and exhaling, testing my resolve and patience. I felt sweat run down my neck despite the chill, my pulse quickening, and realized that every sound, every vibration, was designed to push me toward breaking the rules. As I continued down the corridor, the shadows thickened, pooling into corners, creeping along the edges of the lockers with deliberate intent. The groans became irregular, accented, almost speaking through vibrations in ways my mind could barely interpret. I whispered Rule 10, repeating it like a protective mantra, as I approached a junction leading to the platform's storage bay. The lockers in the distance seemed to pulse with a faint, almost imperceptible glow, tempting the eye, teasing the mind, yet I forced my gaze straight ahead, focusing on the path forward. Obedience was no longer a choice. It was a reflex, a necessary survival tactic in a place where every misstep could be fatal. The vibration from the groans traveled up the steel walls, rattling pipes and cables overhead, and I felt my boots vibrate against the floor with each echo. Shadows moved with unnatural fluidity, stretching and contracting along the walls, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck prickle in response. I whispered Rule 10 again, committing it to memory, as I moved cautiously toward the end of the corridor, aware that one glance back or a moment of hesitation could be disastrous. The lockers remained silent and closed, yet their presence felt like a test, their metallic doors a subtle lure, meant to probe weakness. The platform's rules were living things here, and I realized obedience alone was not enough. Vigilance had to accompany every decision. I reached the junction to the storage bay and paused, feeling the groans intensify, as if the platform were aware of my proximity. Shadows twisted across the corridor floor, some flickering into forms that resembled human limbs before snapping back into abstraction. I whispered Rule 10 once more, repeating it silently like a protective chant, knowing the rule wasn't merely guidance. It was the difference between continued survival and being drawn into the unknown lurking in the shadows. The cold intensified slightly, the vibration under my boots quickened, and I realized that the storage bay, the lockers, and the groaning platform were all synchronized in a test of willpower, timing, and obedience. The lockers loomed behind me, their dark metallic surfaces seemingly pulsing with the rhythm of the groans, but I didn't look back. The shadows flitted closer along the walls, and the vibration underfoot felt like a heartbeat in resonance with my own. I whispered Rule 10 one last time, allowing it to echo in my mind as I navigated toward the platform's inner junction, understanding that the rules weren't arbitrary. They were the only thing tethering me to safety in this living nightmare. Beyond the junction, I could feel the tension thickening, a prelude to Rule 11, the final, most dangerous lesson the platform had left for me, waiting silently in the shadows. I had thought I had survived the platform's worst tests, but as I entered the dimly lit control chamber, I realized the shadows were no longer confined to walls or corners. They were moving on their own, slithering and twisting like dark water across the metal floor. I reminded myself of Rule 11. Never stay in one room when the shadows start moving independently. But my body felt frozen despite knowing I couldn't linger. The temperature dropped sharply, and every breath I exhaled formed a small trembling cloud, visible in the eerie glow of emergency lights. I whispered, "Just keep moving. Just obey the rule." But the shadows reacted instantly to my words, stretching further, pulsating with intent. Harris's teasing voice seemed impossibly distant now, and I realized he would never have believed what I was witnessing. Obedience was the only currency here. I took a cautious step forward, feeling the floor vibrate subtly under the shifting shadows, and my flashlight flickered as if uncertain whether to illuminate reality or illusion. The shapes along the walls twisted into forms that resembled bodies, limbs bending in impossible angles, and yet they moved fluidly, independent of any human logic. I whispered Rule 11 silently, letting the words anchor me as I edged toward the far side of the chamber, knowing that stopping would mean immediate danger. Every instinct screamed that the shadows weren't just reflections. They were sentient, tracking, assessing, perhaps even hunting. The air itself seemed to pulse with their rhythm, the groans from earlier corridors now harmonizing with the movements in the room. I felt a tug of vertigo as the shadows merged briefly into a wall of darkness, stretching across the floor and ceiling simultaneously, creating an impossible depth that made the chamber feel endless. My boots slipped slightly on the metal, and I had to grip a nearby railing to steady myself, heart hammering in terror. I whispered Rule 11, feeling the mantra like a lifeline, guiding me toward the door on the far side. The shadows recoiled slightly as I advanced, almost measuring my obedience, then surged again, reacting to hesitation or fear. I could hear the faint hum of machinery beyond the room, vibrating in synchrony with the shadows' movements, and I realized that the platform itself had become an extension of this darkness. Each step forward felt like a negotiation with the unknown. The shadows shifted faster as I moved, forming patterns that mimicked my body, anticipating each motion. I whispered again, Rule 11, feeling it echo through my mind like a shield. My flashlight revealed fleeting glimpses of shapes that should have been impossible. Limbs bending backward, elongated torsos, forms that seemed to watch me without eyes. I reminded myself that stopping was not an option. To remain in one place would be to invite something I could neither see nor comprehend. The room seemed to contract and expand with the shadows, warping the walls and floor in a way that made each step feel like traversing a different dimension. A sudden creak reverberated across the ceiling, and the shadows snapped toward it, stretching upward like black fingers searching for an opening. I swallowed hard, forcing my pulse to slow, and whispered Rule 11 again, repeating it as a protective chant. Every instinct urged me to run blindly, but I knew that the platform's rules demanded calculated movement, awareness, and respect. The shadows flowed like liquid across the floor, occasionally forming shapes that resembled faces, staring at me with impossible angles and empty voids where eyes should have been. I could feel the cold pressing through my gloves and jacket, seeping into my bones as if the darkness itself were physical. I edged along the side of the chamber, flashlight trained on the walls but careful not to linger in one place, every step deliberate yet urgent. The shadows reacted, shifting and merging in ways that made the room feel alive, conscious, and deeply malevolent. I whispered Rule 11 once more, feeling the words vibrate in my chest as the only tether keeping panic at bay. The air grew heavier, denser, charged with an energy that made it hard to breathe, and I realized that staying in one room too long would allow the shadows to invade not just the space, but the mind itself. I focused on moving, one measured step at a time, heart hammering in rhythm with the pulsing darkness. As I neared the exit door, the shadows converged into a wall of black, motionless for a fraction of a second. then surged toward me, flowing under my boots like ink. The temperature plummeted further, and the metal beneath my hands shivered with unseen energy. I whispered Rule 11, letting it echo in my mind as a final anchor, and I forced my body to move, ignoring the terror screaming at every nerve. The room seemed to expand endlessly in front of me, the shadows racing ahead to block my path, forcing me to navigate a corridor that felt simultaneously solid and liquid, impossible, yet painfully real. A faint, distorted whisper came from the far corner of the room, and my skin crawled as if invisible fingers traced my spine. I reminded myself that stopping would break the rule, and obeying was the only chance I had of survival. The shadows pulsed with a rhythm that matched the distant groans and the erratic hum of the machinery, creating a symphony of fear that was impossible to ignore. I whispered Rule 11 silently one last time, forcing my eyes ahead, heart hammering, pulse synchronized with the platform itself. Every instinct screamed that the shadows were sentient, aware and merciless, and that any lapse would be my last. Finally, I reached the threshold of the next corridor, and for a split second, the shadows seemed to hesitate, almost acknowledging my obedience. But then they rippled violently, spreading across the walls and floor in a way that suggested this was far from over. My breath came in shallow, rapid bursts, and I realized that while I had survived the platform's ultimate test so far, the darkness remained patient, sentient, and hungry. I knew deep in my bones that the final trial wasn't over, that the platform itself had not released me from its grasp. I moved forward, every step careful, aware that the shadows were learning, adapting, observing, and that survival depended on constant vigilance. A low hum rose beneath the floor, harmonizing with the shadows' movements, and I felt the room itself contract, pressing inward as if the walls were alive. I whispered Rule 11 silently, feeling it as the only tether to safety in a place that had no mercy. The shadows swirled around me, stretching beyond the room, following, waiting, testing, and I knew with certainty that the platform's lessons were far from finished. The final rule had been revealed, but its consequences were ongoing, relentless, and impossible to escape. I pushed forward into the corridor, leaving the control chamber behind, the shadows rippling in the corners of my vision, and the metallic hum growing louder, vibrating through every nerve in my body. I realized with a sickening certainty that the platform, the shadows, and the rules were all parts of a single living entity, testing, teaching, and punishing. Obedience had kept me alive this far, but the rules alone were not enough to guarantee survival. As I moved deeper, every step measured, every breath deliberate, I felt the weight of the final lesson settle over me. Heavy, omnipresent, inescapable. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.